And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I am Tori, your host, and with me today is one of my dear BookTube friends and wonderful co-host, Kay. Kay how long have we known each other now?
You know what? Time is irrelevant.
Couple of years, maybe.
Just another way of saying that is I don't know. A couple years.
Yeah. For everybody in the chat, in the description box below this video, you will find a link to Kay's channel and also to a video that Kay put out recently that we will probably reference at some point that you should definitely go and watch, where she talks a little bit more about her journey. And also one of the things that Kay suggested that was wonderful that we included down in the comments is a list of crisis hotlines. So for anybody watching currently or in the replay, just know that those are down in the description box below. We have Wizard. Pete was an hour early.
He was ready to go.
He was ready. Hey, Pete. Anita's here. Jackie. Hey, Jackie.
Awesome. So many people in the chat. It's great to see you guys.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Tim. No, I'm sorry, Andrew. We should do a trio chat at some point. That would be fun.
That would be fun.
J. Patricia Anderson is here. Chris Navo, Lorena. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. Derek B. Okay. Anita and Andrew are drinking together while we have this chat.
Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Fully supported. I'm drinking tea. Does that count?
I have my mysterious mason jar, which is actually water, although that has been contested a few times. Of course. So I'll just start by saying that a couple of the basic disclaimers that we wanted to throw out there before we get started was we realize that this is a huge topic that we're tackling this evening. We will not be able to touch on everything in an hour or an hour and a half. And we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're just sharing our personal experiences. And we would love for anybody in the chat to feel free to ask questions and share thoughts as we go along. And the other thing that I do have to mention is neither Kay or I are medical professionals. So I'm just saying that so it's out there. So everything we'll be sharing is from our own personal experience. And what was the other one? Yes, we're going to be talking about some sensitive topics this evening. So if there's anyone watching, replay or chat, who might be sensitive to mental health or physical health discussions, just be aware of that and take care of yourself. And yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Kay?
No, I think we're good. I think it's just good to remember we're all adults. We're sharing our personal experiences, and everyone's experience is going to be different. So keep that in mind as well. But otherwise, we're just here to chat, and I mean, we're going to see where this goes. But thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, I was so excited when I saw your video come out. It's been like a week now, week or two.
I think so. Yeah.
2 weeks. Yeah. I was really excited when I saw the video because I really appreciate and have appreciated in the past too when other people on the BookTube sphere share their personal journeys about the books they're reading and the different life experiences that they've been through, especially when that comes to physical and mental health. Because I think that transparency is really powerful. And we talk a lot about, there's so many stigmas that still do exist when it comes to physical and mental illnesses. And I think that having that transparency and just open adult conversations is the best way to combat that. So
absolutely. Yeah.
I appreciate you.
Oh, I appreciate you. Thank you. No, I agree. I think it's important to discuss. And I mean, for those watching, it's hard to talk about. I talked about this in the video that I did, but it took me a long time to be willing to talk about it. And you know, I didn't rush it. I didn't put it out. I've been on BookTube for like 2 years. I didn't put it out as one of the first videos for clickbait it. I put it out when I felt ready, and
Mhm.
after I had found books that really clicked with me in that topic. So, you know, if you're looking to hopefully reach out to someone to chat about this, don't rush it. Take your time.
Mhm.
It's not a race, it's a journey. So, definitely don't push things.
Yeah. And I mean, like we kind of mentioned before, going along with that, everybody's journey with these topics is going to be different.
Mhm.
So whatever is helpful for you to take from our, experiences, we're happy to share. And we also
And
understand that everybody's different.
yeah, and leave what doesn't work for you. That's how life
Exactly.
works, right? Take what
Mhm.
helps, leave what doesn't. And yes, Andrew, it has already been 2 years.
Known you guys for so long. So the first thing we wanted to do was talk a little bit about why this topic matters and why we're here this evening to talk about it. So, Kay, are you comfortable starting with you and your definitions and journey and all of that information?
Let's do it. I'll try not to drag it on too long, but I'll cover the basic parts of it. Thank you so much, Samar. I really appreciate it. Basically, at 25, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and for those who don't know, fibromyalgia is a invisible chronic illness which essentially causes widespread pain. Typically, it's also accompanied by fatigue syndrome, so issues sleeping, constantly feeling tired, muscle spasms. The symptoms of it are often related to other illnesses such as lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So, for example, for myself, I often get hand pain, which makes it hard for me to write with pens and color and do all of those things. But at the same time, that doesn't mean I stop. So I've found ways of trying to work the dexterity in my hands through music, which is ukulele, violin, playing those instruments has actually helped in ways to reduce that pain, but it still comes up. That's just one example. So the main one I particularly deal with, apart from the pain and the arthritic type pain, is the muscle spasms. So I will often get muscle spasms various places in my body, legs, shoulders, neck, you name it. If you've ever had a muscle spasm, my God, I feel for you. They are painful. And they do what they want. So I've had spasms that have gone for days because they start in one spot, they move, and they keep going, resulting in muscle weakness, and of course making it difficult to use those muscles. Or if you've really had a you get to that point in your age. I'm in my 30s. You get to a point where you reach your 30th year, and all of a sudden you wake up and you've got a kink and you're like, "All I did was sleep. How did I injure myself in my sleep?" That's basically what fibro is like every day. I turned a corner. How did I pull a muscle? A big combatant for me is constantly trying to keep mobility, keep the muscles relaxed because those muscles are constantly trying to remain tight, which contributes to that pain. So there are several other symptoms, unfortunately, that go with this. But a lot of experiences for people with fibro are going to be different depending on their lifestyle, their treatment, and so on. So that's a overview of my place and how things have gone for me. But I mean, that's a huge topic. We could get into a lot of history. So I'll leave it short and brief there, and we can dive in if people have questions.
Sounds good. And again, comment for the chat. If you guys have questions at any point, feel free to
Mhm.
ask. Obviously, Kay and I will be able to pick and choose if there are any questions that we don't feel comfortable answering, but I think we can handle it.
Yeah, I'm pretty well an open book. We can do
Right.
it.
So I was diagnosed with chronic CPTSD, which is chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and also DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, when I was 28. Yes. Hold on, I had to do the math real quick. In 2019, end of 2019. And for anyone who is not familiar with DID, Dissociative identity disorder is a trauma-based disorder that starts in childhood at or before the age of 7 to 9, when your identity as a person starts to kind of fuse together as you're developing. And basically what happens is your brain, in order to survive certain traumas that are going on in your life, places barriers in between those facets of identity so that they never fully fuse together. And that's where you hear people talk about alters. So you have alternate states of identity that are basically all just trying to function a normal person life through survival mode, basically 24/7. So your brain's basically in survival mode all the time. And usually it is something that people are diagnosed with somewhat later on in life, because you get to a point in your like 20s where you're now a fully fledged adult and you're in functioning society, and you're like, something's not right. And so, yeah, I was 28 when I was diagnosed with both of those. I also have ADHD, but that's kind of its own thing, and not quite, I mean, it's still relevant, but not as much for the discussion we'll have today. So that's kind of the basic, and DID is also a very, it can be a hard to explain disorder. So that's kind of the overview. And again, if there are clarifying questions in the comments, I will do my best to answer them. But Zamar has a question for Kay. Muscle spasms are different than cramps, I suppose.
I would say they are. I mean, they might be maybe it's a same term, but essentially it's a muscle that continues to spasm, and it relents when it wants to relent, but it's quite painful. Basically, think of sending an electric shock through your muscles. And what that would do to your muscle. And you have no control on when it turns off or on. It kind of just happens as it will. I would say a cramp when you're running, you get under your rib, is a lot more tolerable. In my own experience, is a lot more tolerable than the actual spasm itself. And there was a comment, I think from Zen. Right here? I feel for you. Yeah, absolutely. I feel for you. I feel for your mom. That's a lot. And for you, that's a lot to watch her go through. So I do hope there's a improvement there somewhere.
Hi, Cal. Ryan's in the chat. ZK. Yeah. You know, like there's pros and cons, you know. When we are really into something and get really hyper focused on it, we can accomplish a lot of amazing things. It's just getting there. Cal says, I'm part of the fibro party. It's not a party.
I mean, define party.
Right, define party.
Are we laying on a sofa? Are we reading and just like vegging out? That's a party to me.
I'm there. Yeah, it is funny because I have heard people say, oh, DID sounds like fun. It's like having a bunch of friends in your head. And I'm like, not exactly.
Now think of all the challenges that happen elsewhere in life.
Fun isn't usually a word that I would use to describe either of those things. No. Chris says, despite exercising consistently, I suffer from sciatica in my left leg, which goes numb anytime I stand up for long periods. Curious if you also experience that, Kay.
I've only experienced sciatic pain once in my life, and that was when I was pregnant and my child decided to put a foot on that specific nerve. That was not fun. But I do need to make sure I shift postures often. So standing, sitting, I have trouble being in one or the other for too long. So usually you'll see me shifting a lot. Like if you're over for a cup of tea or a snack or something, I'll be moving. It's hard for me to stay sitting. It's hard for me to stay standing. But yeah, it gets uncomfortable.
Sciatica sucks.
It really does.
Ryan, I'm assuming is this question for me or Kay? I'm assuming me. Handled in a certain well-known series, if you know, you know. Do you think it was handled well in that story? I could, at some point, I think I know what you're talking about. If you're talking about DID.
Okay.
which I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
But
I don't watch a lot of TV, so I assume it's for you.
well, I think it's a book. Yeah, he's talking about
Oh,
a
is
book
it book?
series. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know that it's really super big spoilers to say what series it is. I just will leave it at that. Stormlight Archive is the one I'm assuming, Ryan, you're talking about.
Mm.
I do intend to actually do a video on that at some point, because one of the things that I think happened is that originally the author didn't necessarily intend it to be that specific, but the fandom kind of took it and ran with it and made it like a
Mm.
poster child. And no, I mean, and again, I blame the fandom honestly more than I blame the author for the origins of that.
Mm.
But yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think, and this is something we're going to talk about later that I want to make very clear. I am not the type of person that is going to, like, you know, cancel an author for writing a character in a way that isn't quite the way we'd like to see it,
Mm.
right? So I'm not that kind of a person. I do think that some of the language surrounding the character in question was not helpful. But then again, I
Mm.
don't know that he was necessarily writing it for that disorder specifically. So it's kind of a, you know, complicated conversation. But I'm guessing that's, yeah. Yes, that is what you're talking about. Okay, good. But yeah, I will probably do a video on that whole situation at some point. Cal says, yeah, exactly.
Pretty much, yeah.
We love you, Andrew.
Andrew, yeah, all the love.
Big hugs. It makes me, this is something that I really struggle with, is it's really hard for me when I know things that my friends have been through that I just want to go back in time and, like, you know.
Yeah. Bring it on.
Bring it on. So one of the first things that we talked about that we wanted to bring up when it comes to our diagnoses specifically, and I think it was important to us to talk a little bit about our personal journey before we start getting into the book side of things, just so everybody kind of has an awareness of where we're coming from, and also because you can't talk about the fictional version of things without talking about the reality, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that you had brought up in our discussion earlier was grief over diagnoses and what
Yeah.
that looked like, because that's its own mental health topic by itself. So
How long
do you
we
want
got?
to, right, I'm good.
Yeah, I can dive into that a bit. So, yeah, there essentially when you finally get that diagnosis, at least for me, because again, when we're talking about these things, it's our own experience, even in terms of grief.
Mhm,
Grief and losing someone is going to be different for everyone. Grief, in this case, is the loss of the idea of your well-being that you thought you had, or
mhm,
you thought at least was left, and the future you thought you might have, and how that's now being altered. So essentially, it's your entire perception of your future, what you think you are. Like, I'm okay. This is just a small problem. We can fix that.
mhm,
And then you
mhm,
finally get that diagnosis that says, well, yes, but however, no. So it's an entire experience of grief for that state.
mhm,
Your experience with that is going to be different. But even leading up to that point of the diagnosis, everyone's experience is going to be different, because your journey in seeking an answer is going to
mhm,
be vastly different from anyone who even has the same diagnosis. I know for myself, it was full of anxiety because I had struggled for years with this pain, the spasms. My body just kept feeling like it was breaking apart. I'd wake up feeling like I was 60 instead of 20, and I couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. And there were some few scares that I did have in terms of spasms. I had one spasm that it ended up being a spasm. I thought it was a heart attack, but it was a spasm in my esophagus
oof,
area, and I thought it was a bigger problem. Luckily, it was just a spasm there. But stress, all of those things impacted, and of course, the anxiety leading up to it was, I don't know what's wrong, so I'm going to panic about everything regarding my
mhm,
health. And so I did go through that. When I finally got the diagnosis, it was grief for the future I thought I had, the well-being I thought I had left, and the hope
Mm-hmm.
of getting help as well, because with fibromyalgia, there's no known cause.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no solid means of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So there was also the grief of, oh, once I get the answer, I'll have a fix for it. It'll be
Mm-hmm.
easy peasy just like that. No, not at all. So there was that grief in that aspect as well. And then the long journey after, which has its own ups and downs of trying to figure out how to balance this new lifestyle, this new standard of health with trying to lead a normal-ish
Mm-hmm.
life and do it in a way where you're meeting expectations from the world as well,
Mm-hmm.
not just your own standards, and you're trying to do all the trial and error, because in terms of fibromyalgia, it's all trial and error to figure
Mm-hmm.
out how your best form of pain management is going to take place. Some people work with medications. That didn't work for me. For me, it was an entire routine and lifestyle change. And of course, there was grief with that too, because now my standard lifestyle was gone and out the window, and I had to figure out new ways of living. Relationships change because I wasn't as physically capable to do things I would have pushed myself to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lots of stages of grief, I would say, but the diagnosis one is the one I think will hit harder.
Mm-hmm.
Everything after that is just it kind of steps and stages. Um,
Right.
but like I said, it's gonna be different for everyone. Mine was just that loss of perceptive future and well-being that I had hoped would be there.
Mm-hmm.
And, stories talk about hope being a huge part of the human experience. Hope pulls us through to the end. But what
Mm-hmm.
do you do when that hope is swept out from under your feet?
Right.
How do you find new hope? Are you willing to find new hope? Those
Mm-hmm.
are big questions that you have to ask yourself as you go through those journeys. And yeah, I think in that time, it's hard to remember to be kind to yourself because you're so focused on just trying to get better and better fast, which isn't going to happen as quickly as you
Right.
think.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely relate to, I think, maybe a different type of grief because, like, I kind of had an inkling before I got the official diagnosis that I kind of knew what was
Mhm.
going on. And I didn't necessarily, it's one of those things where, like, but you're not sure you want to be right, you know? And the diagnosis itself was so incredibly liberating because after a lifetime of feeling incredibly invalidated, I suddenly had a validation for there's a reason why your brain is responding the way that it is. There's a reason why all of these symptoms that you've been living with for years are there. And it is something that, you know, we can work on.
Mhm.
And, you know, there's not, there's a lot of different schools of thoughts when it comes to treatment for DID that might work for some people and might not work for others. And it really depends on the individual again, and it really depends on the therapist that you're working with and all of these different factors. And the thing for me is there's not a lot of trained therapists who are have had a lot of experience with
Mm.
trauma-based, not just trauma-based disorders, but like DID specifically, dissociative disorders specifically. And I was very, very lucky to have a trauma-based specialist who diagnosed me. And she really did a lot of work with me in the first few years towards stability and alleviating a lot of the symptoms that I'd been dealing with for years and years and years of my life. Um, so I think the grief for me came in more in wondering or being afraid of what I was going to lose once I had the diagnosis, once I
Right.
had that label, so to speak, that has to go on paperwork and the label that, I sometimes have to use to explain things or whatever it might be. At that point, I was already a mom with young kids. how is that going to
Yeah.
affect them? You know, and there's that fear of how, you know, what am I going to lose? But also I need this.
Yeah.
Like, it's such an impossible thing, you know? And, you know, it has been a really hard road. A good one, like in the point that I'm at the most stable I've ever been in my life. But I've lost relationships that were very
Yeah.
near and dear to me because of my diagnosis. I have dealt with a lot of discrimination and invalidation because of my diagnosis, because it's the fake mental health disorder, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the grieving and I think it goes back for me way beyond that to the root of the PTSD in childhood, in grieving the life. Like, anybody who's been through trauma will understand that. I think that you grieve the life you might have had without it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that might be very similar to, you know, getting that diagnosis with fibro, and, well, what would my life have looked like without it, you know?
Absolutely. There's one thing that Cal said as well, and I mentioned this in my video too, which is it's a grief of this is a life sentence as
Yeah.
well. It has that kind of imprisonment feel
Yeah.
to it. And yeah, I'd say it's very similar in that regard too.
Mm-hmm. You know, what's funny is that on this topic, specifically with hope, is I was reading a poetry collection recently, and it was more like a collection of thoughts that are meant to be encouraging, and, you know, and one of them that I actually put as the background on my phone is, hope is a small rebellion.
Mm,
And I really liked that
okay.
twist of it. I was like, because hope is something I've really struggled with a lot too. And I was
Yeah.
like, it's not a word that I've had a great relationship with. um, but I liked the twist
Yeah.
of that. And I was
No,
like, okay,
I could see that rebellions can
yeah,
be quashed. They can be or
yeah,
squashed, whatever the word is for that.
yeah,
But they can also be rekindled.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, see, I'm trying.
Joe had a comment there
Mm,
too, hearing a
mhm,
diagnosis like this for your child. Yeah,
I believe that.
heartbreaking. My child is still very little, but, you only want the best for your children, right?
Mhm,
You wanna support them however you can. You want them to have the best life possible, and, it's impactful to everyone, not just you who's experiencing it.
mhm. It's amazing how intricately tied our mental and physical healths are. Absolutely.
Yeah, I will say, you were talking about earlier how, there's a period of your life where things have progressively gotten better because you put the work in, right? You put
Yes.
that work
Yeah.
in and it's starting to pay off. You've seen those years of betterment. And it's the same for myself after I found a pain management routine and reoriented my life and certain ways, things progressively got better. But it was only because I also worked on that mental health aspect
Yeah.
that it started to also improve my physical health. Because
Mhm,
definitely when things got stressful, when work was bombarding and overwhelming, my physical health deteriorated really quickly. And that's
mhm.
where, like, with that spasm I was talking about in my esophagus, I was actually on a stress leave. And I got that spasm about 5 minutes after a very inappropriate phone call from the aggressive boss who did not agree with the stress leave. And they were checking in to see when I was coming back to work. So, yes, mental health impacts physical very much so and vice versa.
Mhm. Absolutely. Fantasy Wash says, brain injury, illness here. Feel you both deeply.
Yeah.
This is a topic that we're going to get to
Mm,
in a
yes.
second, because absolutely, Laura. Um, Thank you for joining us, Kaiju.
Thank you.
Let's see. My intro to psych professor was a DID disbeliever. Needless to say, they didn't last long in the psych department. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's tough because, you know, with the boom of mental illness social media, which has been a great thing for, you know, helping spread awareness of people's experiences and information about these different things, it can also be a detriment because it becomes a fad in some circles where
Mhm.
it becomes sensationalized, and that makes it really difficult for people who really do struggle with these issues to be taken seriously. And that's something that makes me very upset, and I'm going to put it over there for this rest of this conversation.
That's fair. It's a whole other topic on its own.
Oh, it totally
basically.
is. I braced for heavy, but this is hitting hard already. Such a good and necessary thing. Thank you, Tim. I hope it's helpful, honestly, because like when I first started my channel, I had just gotten my diagnosis like several months before. And I went through a very big change in my particular disorder over the year of 2020, which is weird to look back on. Like if I watch the videos from the beginning of 2020 to the end, it's a very weird experience for me.
This is why I don't go back.
Yeah. And I was so terrified to say it out loud. I was so terrified. There were a couple of videos like a year and a half ago where I kind of like threw something into the middle of the video where I was like, and the only reason I'm talking about this is because, by the way, I have DID. And then here's the other time, you know, like, and I was so afraid to say it out loud. And I was like, okay, but I don't want to be afraid of it. I'm not defined by my diagnosis. Yeah. I'm a person who happens to have my diagnosis carried alongside. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for people like Kay and everyone else who's been really open about their own journeys with their health, because I think it opens the door for these kind of discussions, and they're so necessary.
Absolutely. And agreed. Thank you for sharing your experience too. And to everyone in the chat as well for sharing and, you know, being willing to be vulnerable, because that's a huge part of it too, is how vulnerable you're willing to be in order to improve. And even just in sharing with someone who you trust, being vulnerable is really difficult. So absolutely. Thank you all.
So since Laura brought it up, let's touch on invisible illnesses, shall we?
Fun.
How fun. And this is something I think that ties in with the discussion about seeing it in fantasy, because I think it's you're going to see more of the, I don't even want to say more obvious. That sounds horrible, but you know what I mean? Like I would imagine that writing an invisible illness is as hard as it is to live with one, because like there's so much nuance to it that it's almost impossible to capture.
Well, and like even in trying to relay stories, you know, you're describing a room, you're describing everything in the room and the character's experience of the room, but then you really have to get into those like the brain of the character, right? So you're going from describing a room, describing these aspects that really immerse the reader, but then how do you get the reader invested in the character? And this applies to just going through emotional journeys as well, right? If you're writing an emotional arc for your character, that is difficult on its own, but then throw onto the plate all of the invisible illnesses and aspects, and how do you convey them accurately in a way that is still interesting to a reader and emotionally invest them, because that emotional investment is what's really going to sell the story. Those I mean, I can't imagine how hard you would be better at explaining that. I would think, being the author you are.
I mean, like we're going to touch on later some of the things that we've seen in the pros and cons of what we've seen written in fantasy. And one of the things that I would say is an easy starting point for that is just like asking yourself first, why is this character, or why do I want to write this character with this specific experience? And whatever your answer to that is, if you're going to include that, knowing there's a responsibility there, and not just utilizing it for like a shock value of like, I'm using this specifically because I want an emotional response from the reader.
Right.
That's not a reason I would recommend including. You know, it might be something like, for me, you know, I have a character in the Legends of the Bruhai who struggles with a physical deformity that Kay has been incredibly helpful in helping me think through her character and the struggles that she might face going forward. And it just sort of was part of her character. Like, as she started to take shape, it was a piece of the puzzle of who she was. And I found that that felt a lot more natural to me than sitting down and be like, okay, I'm going to have this person have this, you know? And it just sort of like, when your characters take on that life, those little things will start to pop out, and you'll start noticing, oh, I think, like, okay, this person struggles with this, or this person, this is, you know, something that they're going to have to deal with on their journey through the story or whatever. And I found that that so far has felt like a pretty honest approach to it for me so far. And it's also helpful to have friends who are willing to help you think through the different facets of that.
Well, I'm honored that you even considered me for help on that one. But but I actually want to touch on what you said there, as it being a puzzle piece of the character, because I think that's important in life as well. It's these diagnoses, these things that we live with, are a puzzle piece of our life. They're, at least for myself, I don't view it as my identity.
Right.
It doesn't control my life. Rather, I work my life in a way that allows me to balance it with everything else, so I can still enjoy things, I can still do things, but I don't go out and say, "Oh, woe is me. I just met you off the street. Did you know X, Y, and Z about me?"
Right.
It's not. I don't wear it as a badge. It's just something I live with, and it's just a part of a big puzzle of who I am. And I think that's important to remember too, for, whatever people are
Yeah.
working through, whether it's mental or physical, and invisible illness, because you know what's going on on the
Right.
inside. But
Exactly.
to everyone else, the common feedback I've gotten is, "Oh, but you're young. You should be able to do that." Okay, Susan. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. I appreciate that. Yes, I should. It was, but no, unfortunately not. And I think the perception of reality often, because of how we look, is perceived differently. Might look okay now. In 5 minutes, I'll be limping.
Yeah, exactly.
And you
Well,
won't notice it.
and that's such a great point, though, for, for anybody who's writing characters like this, is recognizing not only are you working with the character themselves and their journey through whatever they're experiencing, but how do the characters around them respond to what they're dealing with? Do they know? Can they see it? Can they not see it? Like, how much does this character divulge to other people? Like, those are all things too, not just with them individually, but the sociology of the relationships in the story. How does that, fit into all of those pieces as well?
Absolutely. It's going to break down your world as well in terms of prejudice. So, for example, in fibromyalgia, it was believed to be in women's brains, because fibromyalgia is very heavily
Mm-hmm.
predominant female, in terms of diagnosis. But I think I want to say 50, but it's actually more than that now, because 20 years have gone by. So closer to 70 years ago, it was perceived as it's in your head. It's
Yeah.
all in your head. They couldn't, because it was very new. No one really cared to look further into it at the time. It was the hysteria, the woman's hysteria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and as time went on, obviously that changed, but we still have those doctors who are practicing
Right.
then, still practicing now, and
Right.
who still have that prejudice, and still have to, you have to navigate around that when you come across those doctors. And so in stories, it's the same thing, right? You might have prejudice, you might have particular belief systems, because you're dealing with different cultures,
Right.
different forms of history and timeline. So in terms of, as an author, it that would be fascinating to explore, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's fascinating in our own world, but we often view it as a hindrance, because it comes with flaws directly related to us. In a story, it'd be far more fascinating, because
Mm-hmm.
the consequences aren't as direct,
Right.
in a fantastical world where you can separate a little bit. So,
Right.
uh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed.
So an actual situation that happened was, when I found out, I told my grandparents, and my grandparents, after like a couple months, they came back and told me that because they would go out for coffee with their old buddies, and I'm talking like 60s, 70s, right? And they would go out for drinking with their buddies and Gab, and they came back and they're like, "Oh, Betsy, she's got the fibro too, and we told her you had it, and she was amazed because you were so young." And I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "Normally, it's the old people that get it." And I'm like, "I don't know what to tell you."
Whoops.
I think it's just that because it's becoming more diagnosable, all of
Right.
them are diagnosed now, as they should, but it was just one of those for me, that was a hilarious moment to have my grandparents come back and say, "We went out for coffee and Betsy told me."
I love your impersonation of your family members so much. That's adorable.
Not accurate, I'm just saying. It's just because I'm pretty sure my mother's in here watching somewhere, not accurate. Don't tell grandpa and grandma.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I've heard some pretty fun ones. One is one of the first of a family member when I first was diagnosed. And I explained that this is a trauma-based disorder and that like the trauma is like, the catalyst, not the DID and the alters. They're the because of part. You're like, well, how do you get rid of them? And I'm like, so that's me as a whole. So like, I don't know how to answer that question. Like, it's all separate, but it's still, one system. So that's not possible, but sorry.
And to be fair, when we're talking about this as well, in terms of those kind of questions that may seem insensitive,
Yeah.
at least the person had the interest to ask, where some people might just outright be hurtful.
Right.
So while the question may not be helpful or appropriate in some ways, at least there was the interest there.
Right.
Because that's a completely different topic too, and that's not to like belittle anyone's experience with that kind of interaction, but something to remember too is that your perception of those interactions greatly impacts your own experience in the
Well,
end.
and two, I think, and I don't know, I won't speak for you, obviously, but for my part, now that I'm in a very different phase of healing and trauma work with all of this, I'm very open to people who are genuinely interested in learning more and saying, what is this? How does it work? I have no issue with those kinds of questions, because I can tell if somebody's coming in with just a genuine curiosity and wanting to understand more, rather than I'm going to tell you about your disorder or why it's wrong or why you don't have it.
Yeah, there is that defining line.
For sure.
Oh, look, I got approval from my mother. Great.
Excellent.
Thanks,
Fantastic.
Mom.
Hi, RA. I missed a question. Oh yeah, here we go. Pete says, do you feel that your experiences with stories as a kid, specifically how the characters you read dealt with problems, affected how y'all dealt with these things?
I think that's a little hard for me to answer personally, because while looking back now as an adult, I can see some of those symptoms. Like the hand pain was one. I always struggled with pens and holding a pen for very long, but I wouldn't have known that as a kid. However, I will say that looking back on those stories that I did read as a kid, I did see a theme there of the underdog, the person who struggled and overcame adversity. I love those stories. And I think, as you look back at your childhood growing into an adult and the things that kind of defined your perceptions in life, that was definitely one of them for me. And it definitely assisted in the drive to achieve the best I could and overcome rather than wallow and let it consume me.
Yeah, I've also been similarly drawn ever since I was young to stories about characters who went through really hard things and still managed to fight back or to overcome in some way, or like do the right thing anyways, or like a lot of those kind of themes. or not that I necessarily always need like a traditional happy ending, but I love to see characters fighting back for a purpose and like trying to rise above the hand that life has dealt them.
Yeah.
White Fang being one of my favorite childhood books, probably says a lot about me. But that was kind of, you know, not to spoil anything for people that haven't read it yet, but it's been around for a while. So there's, you know, the character goes through a lot of things and doesn't really have a voice in the sense that a lot of our characters, human characters in the books we read, do. And that was something I related to very heavily as a kid. And later on, he's still able to express love even after all the things he's been through in his own way, you know. And it's just it's such a powerful story. I still, that story meant so much to me as a kid, because it was like this, oh well, I could be like that, I could, you know. And that, as you know, when you're really young and you're trying to search for something to kind of give you the what comes next, light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
Yeah, that one was a really, really big one for me.
I haven't read that one, so that's interesting to hear.
If you're friends with me, yeah, you probably will at some point.
Well, that's it. It's going on the TBR.
It's a hard read, so just for anybody in the chat who hasn't read it yet, like, please be aware it is a very heavy read. It was also written a long time ago, so there are a couple things in there that are not really socially acceptable anymore. So just be aware of that. But it is an incredibly powerful story and one of the best character explorations I've seen. Was super impactful for me when I was young. So I think before diagnosis, a lot of us are secretly taking on a lot of the self-blame behind the scenes. When you get the diagnosis, you think, okay, this isn't my fault, but the world doesn't like that. That's true.
Yeah.
And I will say, on the other side of that, how much I've appreciated, like, I have a community around me here and also in my personal life, a support system that I am so incredibly grateful for, that I can lean on. And that's something that I know, like, that's such an important part of healing, is finding your village and reaching out. And that vulnerability we talked about earlier, is the first step is having to be vulnerable with people and be open. And that can be really hard at the beginning.
And along that note, I think Kaiju further up said it's hard to even be vulnerable with yourself in total privacy.
Absolutely.
That's a whole journey in and on its own. Yeah. But yeah, support is huge. And that's another journey, right? Finding those supports.
Yep.
Finding the people you can feel safe with. You know, for me, it's my husband. He's a huge support, as well as others in my life. But because, you know, we're living together and everything like that. If we have company over and we're sitting down and chatting and I wince, company won't really pay any mind to it, but my husband is immediately like locked on and he's like, "Are you okay?
You okay?" Right? Yeah.
Yep. Good.
Yep.
You know? So it's helpful, because for myself, I'm just like, "Oh, dang it. You know, like, get through this." And he's the one that's making sure I'm okay. Whereas I'm just like, fight it.
Yeah. Yep. It was very cute because Ben, my husband, before we went live, he came in and he knows that I get a little anxious when I talk about deeper topics like this, which I think is very normal. And he was like, you know what? Afterwards, if you just want to like crash on the bed and we'll just, what do you want to eat? Like, it was really sweet. So yeah, just having someone in your life that like knows those things about you and knows what you're going through. Even if it's a stranger, sometimes we open up and like in the comments, you guys are all sharing these amazing journeys that you've had and the things that you've struggled with, and you're not alone. Like, we're all here and we're listening, and that voice is so important when you're dealing with stuff. Feel free to DM me if you want, Zen or Kay. I'm assuming, if I don't want to speak for you, but
nope. Yep. DM me if you feel comfortable.
Laura says, you'll be shocked when you start sharing this stuff how my infertility journey ended up finding beautiful communities of people that way.
I'm really happy to hear that too.
Yeah, me too.
Me.
I'm behind on the comments a little bit, but I'll kind of come down here. Not chronic pain related, but I've gotten the, oh, but you make eye contact so well response from people when I've told them I have autism spectrum disorder. Yep. Yeah. My favorite is with DID. A lot of people will be like, but I've never seen you like change. And I'm like
it's a costume.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, that's kind of the whole point of the disorder, is to like not look like you're different. You know, that's kind of the whole point.
And I think what's the term? Masking, I think, is a term.
Yes.
You know, and this spreads across various you know, diseases and diagnoses, but masking is a huge thing. We're
Huge thing.
trying to pretend like we're normal so people don't find out.
Right. Right.
You know?
Yep.
That like twitch you just saw? No, I was just stretching.
Yeah, about it. Yeah. I feel like these issues are getting a lot more representation in modern stories. I wonder how different the experience will be for our kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
I look forward to my kids having experience reading a lot of different characters with a lot of different experiences, because I think it just makes us more empathetic as human beings. So
absolutely.
Yes, White Fang. Got a couple White Fang fans. Love that. Shad says, I appreciate the discussion. I got diagnosed with Stargard's in 2016, which basically led me to lose my vision. I'm considered legally blind, not actually blind. It was definitely an adjustment. I believe that.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Hi, Brian. Ava says, Tori has saved me on my own mental health journey a few times. Her willingness to be open and honest was truly healing to me. Honestly, I think whenever people reach out to me on social media, you're doing all the work, to be honest. Like, I'm just there as a listening ear, and the hardest part of the work that happens and the most important part of the healing happens on the other side of the screen. Okay, so if we want to touch on the last part about invisible illnesses really quick before we move into characters, learning to set boundaries was something that we brought up as a really important topic of discussion that we just wanted to touch on briefly, because I know that's been a journey for me.
Yeah. So boundaries go all kinds of ways, right? That could be relationship wise. That could be your relationship with food, right? Even because I know for myself, in terms of my lifestyle, I found that staying within a impacts my pain level. So how much weight I have on or off, it impacts it negatively. So I always try and stay within an area, but then I'm also a foodie. I'm sure you guys have seen on my channel. I love my bread. I will carbs.
Yes.
So it's a battle. It's a struggle at times with that. But setting boundaries, saying, you know what, I can enjoy this, I can do that, but I also need to be mindful of X, Y, and Z. Same thing for relationships. Like I had mentioned earlier, some relationships I just couldn't partake in the physical aspect of the relationship, and some of those relationships turned into something positive, and others just kind of fell off the map, which is okay. That's life. That is life.
Yeah.
You're going to come through all kinds of relationships through all different stages in your life, and that's part of it. But I think what's important is, in terms of boundaries, you're figuring them out, right? You've just got your diagnosis. You're going through all of those things. You're learning as you go, and that's perfectly fine. But I think, at least in my experience, it was hard to set those boundaries. And I'm sure it is for many others as well, where setting those boundaries, I was a people pleaser for a long time. I wanted to keep those friends. I wanted to do those things. I pushed myself farther than I should have. And especially in terms of work, I often pushed myself farther than I should have, and I ended up suffering for it later. I learned the hard way. Don't do that, people. Don't do it. I often learn the hard way. But those are the moments that actually stuck. And sometimes you just have to learn the hard way if you're
Yeah.
stubborn like me. So, your journey with that is going to be different, but it's important because in the end, you're advocating for yourself.
Yep.
Advocacy for yourself is so, so important. And that applies to all different facets. When I became a parent, my boundaries changed completely. They changed entirely from what they used to be. And that's going to happen anytime you have something new happen in your life, too. So,
Hmm.
um, basically, what comes out of it is boundaries take care of you, as well as ensuring as positive of an experience in your life as you can. So it's in your best interest, as hard as it might be to enforce.
Hmm. Well, and I think also one of the things that took me a while to learn is because of the particular nature of my CPTSD and the trauma responses that I have, I often struggled with feeling like people were obligated, or that I was obligated to share with people whatever they wanted to know
Right.
about what I was going through. And I didn't have that boundary of saying, I don't feel safe sharing this,
Mm,
because I was also a people pleaser in a way that was like, I need to adjust to make sure that I'm protecting everyone else's emotional experience before my own, right?
right. We had
Um,
complete opposite experiences. I was like, "No one will know. I will fake this as best as I can. I will fake normalcy."
I faked it as much as I could until people asked questions. That's the thing.
Okay,
Like as soon as
that's
they
fair.
got, um, and then there was like no boundary of, I just felt like I had to share everything, anything they wanted to know. And then
Right.
what happened is I started noticing, like, while there were some really supportive, well-meaning people, there were also people who took my experience and kind of laid it out on the table and kind of microscoped over it and was like, here's my critiques of all of this situation. And that's not helpful, especially when you're in early healing days and you're like, I can't handle this. You shouldn't
Yeah.
have to. Like, learning that it is okay for me to say, I'm not comfortable sharing that. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, people aren't entitled to your story. It's a
Mhm.
privilege when you get to hear somebody else's experience,
Yeah.
and what they're willing to share with you. And whenever I have people share with me, I'd really focus on that as my
Mhm.
response, because it's like, they didn't have to trust me with this, but they
Yeah.
did. And that's really special. That shows a level of vulnerability that's really special and rare. Um, so yeah, I'd say that. And then also, in terms of reading, it is okay to set boundaries with the
Yeah.
stories you are reading. If there is something that you are reading that is really just, even if it's like a not for now, if there's a book that you
Mhm.
like, at this particular part of my healing journey or wherever I'm at, I'm not okay with this. That's okay. I'm a huge believer in DNFing books if you hit something that's like, nope. Um, and I mean, a very recent example of this was when I was reading Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb, which I did a video about, and my very strong, visceral response to the book and a lot of the things that happen in it. And so many of my very wonderful friends were like, Tori, you can put it down.
Yeah.
And I stubbornly finished the book because I was, no, I'm going to finish it. Dang it.
Yep.
And like, it was good because I had a lot of things I wanted to talk about and it was an important thing for me to work through. But I also recognize I didn't really give myself the option,
Yeah.
you
That
know?
yeah.
And not looking back, I don't know that I would have done anything differently, but knowing that I should have had that conversation with myself to sit down and be like, look how this is affecting us right now. Is that okay? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I wanna add to that too because the constant, um, the constant I don't wanna say need or desire, but necessity
Yeah.
to be self-aware is such a mental
Hmm.
load as well. Sometimes you just wanna read through the book, and sometimes you're like, "No,
Yeah.
I can get through this.
I
It's
can do
fine. What
this.
is wrong with me? Like,
Yeah.
why am I having an issue with this? It's just a book.
Yeah.
It's fine."
Yeah.
But that you know, there is that necessity to continuously self-check. And
Mhm.
sometimes we're stubborn, sometimes it's hard, we don't wanna put it down. I hate DNFing books.
Mhm.
I think I DNF a book maybe once or twice a year. And that's I'm stubborn too, so I feel for you because that's not something, you know, you're constantly gonna be aware of at every experience.
Right. And that's where this community can be so helpful, is because, we don't know what's in the book oftentimes because we haven't
Yeah.
read it. So putting it out there, and just I had somebody on one of my videos my video that just came out yesterday, who was like, "Can you share more about the trigger warnings in this book that you read this month?
Right.
Because I'm not sure if I'm okay with it or not." And so I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And I just laid out like the list, and that's where it's okay to ask. Again, that's another
Yeah.
vulnerability thing where you're like, can you somebody like explain exactly what I'm in for and so I can decide if this is going to be for me right now. Um
Absolutely.
so yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
and that's where reviews are helpful too. Right?
mhm,
Reviews, I'll if there is something that I think will be triggering or pops out to me, I'll try and include those if I can, and I should get better at it, but I will scope reviews as well
mhm,
to see if there
mhm.
is something that might be triggering, in
Yep,
content to me,
yep.
particularly if a book gets super hyped, because usually those books are the culprit.
Yep. Yeah. I have also found that there are some, yeah, I don't know, things. Yeah, that is something I want to definitely commit to more again this year. Is I want to do more video reviews for books as well, because I
Mhm.
feel like that's something I haven't really put the time and effort into that I would like to.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. I know they're not like the content that on booktube that typically does well, but I think that they're never going to go anywhere. They're so important. They're
No.
such an important part of what we do in this little sphere of book nerdery.
And they
um,
can be fun too, like,
oh
I
yeah.
I have fun with them. I if they don't get watched a whole lot, that's fine, but I have fun putting them together because the whole point of why I started my channel was because I needed to just blarb, just get
Yeah.
it out, word vomit it out, get
Yep.
it all out there about why I love books, and, you know, those reviews are a great format for it.
Mhm. I want to catch up a little bit on the chat before we
Yeah.
keep going. Hi, Britton. Um, exactly, Ryan. Um,
Yeah, they turned it into a group project without
oh
asking.
yeah. Oh yeah. Elaine says, I've lost a lot of friends, but now I have a few really excellent friends. I'm learning not to be too defensive. That's a really good, healthy approach to
Yes.
that. It's a very mature approach to that, because, yeah, that can be really hard. It is really hard.
Absolutely. I'm glad to hear you've got that excellent group of friends with you too.
Hmm. That is the really beautiful silver lining of losing people
Mhm.
close to you, is that the people that stay even
Mhm.
through all of those things, who see you for the person you are as a whole and decide to stay.
Yeah.
Um, those are just really beautiful relationships. Britton, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm sorry for your loss, dude.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's such a hard thing to go through.
Hmm. Chris has a hot topic question for us. What do you
Oh.
think of authors putting disclaimers at the beginning of their books?
Ah,
You want me to tackle that first, or are you going to go for
I've
it?
I mean, if you have an answer off the top of your head, go for it.
I'm a little torn on this issue, to be perfectly honest. Um, I think I would love where there's like, I don't know, there's so many different facets to this question. I personally lean a lot more heavily on the community for my content warnings than I do the book itself, because having people who know my reading tastes and can say, Tori, you specifically might have an issue with X things, as opposed to, here's a giant blanket statement of all of the things that are in the book. you know, it's such a tough thing, because I know that there are some people that are really, really sensitive to the topics that can be contained in
Mhm.
the books that we read. And I'm not discounting that in any way, shape, or form. And I'm going to say something it's a personal opinion. So I'm just going to preface that but it also isn't the author's responsibility to handle my triggers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if they do include content warnings in the book, that's great. That's their choice. And I appreciate that they're doing that for their readers. But I also I'm not going to discredit an author because they don't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
so, and I also know, reading fantasy and some of the other genres that we read, I just kind of am aware of the fact that there's often going to probably be topics that, could come up. And I think it really depends too on where you're at in your healing journey, because there's so many different, there would have been times a few years ago where certain things I wouldn't have even been able to read it. It would have like completely ruined my day. Whereas now I'm able to handle that in a little bit of a more detached way. I'm not quite as confronted by it as much. So recognizing that for people who are sensitive to certain topics to a higher level than I am, there should be a way for those people to know what is in those books and the content. I think I also have a little bit of an issue that it sometimes spoils a lot of so like I don't really want to know everything that's in the book so yeah, it's a really complicated question. And I don't know that I really answered it very well, Chris, but okay.
Well, my best. I think for myself, if the author wants to put it in, by all means, it's a tool, right? I've heard debates about people who dislike having the character lists and the
Yeah.
cultural lists.
Yeah.
There are people who don't like those indexes. I love them because I love going back and referencing because I'm terrible with names and I'm like, who is this dude I just read 10 pages ago and now is relevant to the main plot? But in terms of trigger warnings, if the author is willing to do it, fantastic. I don't think that there's necessarily a responsibility or a pressure. At least I don't feel like the author has to. If they want to, fantastic. When I started reading, I'll be honest, I had no idea what a trigger warning was
I
in
didn't either.
reading. I didn't
Yeah.
know where to look for it. I didn't even think it was a thing I needed to be mindful of. And, I also find for myself, two authors can handle the topic very differently and how
100%.
they go about the theme. So if there is a particular trigger that might hit hard for me, one author's exploration of it might hit really hard, but
Sure.
another author's exploration of it, no problem.
Yeah.
It's entirely different, and I do like you said, it's the responsibility of the reader to be mindful of what they're reading, the content. If you say, "Hey, Kayla, read this grimdark fantasy book," I'm not gonna expect rainbows. I'm not gonna expect sunshine and a
Yeah.
musical out of it. I'm gonna expect the worst of humanity and the
Right.
possible, directions of the world. But it's also my responsibility to take that recommendation, do my own research. Like I said earlier, those reviews are so helpful. But yes, Grimbos. We'll call them that. We'll call them
Crimbos.
that. But yeah, I say it's up to the author, but it's the reader's responsibility to do some homework if they
Yep.
are needing to be more mindful of those triggers for themselves. And like I said, I had no idea they even existed when I started.
Yeah. I'll get up to some of the comments above this, but Derry,
Mhm.
you do make a really good point, and I do want
Mhm.
to make note of this because I do agree with you on this too. Is that trigger warnings are incredibly valuable to the people who need it, and that most readers don't have a bookish community who can help them
Yeah,
specifically. Yeah, and so
absolutely.
that's why I know that it's a really nuanced question because each reader is going to approach it differently, have different experiences, need different things from the book and what they're expecting of it. And Brian kind of brought that up
Yeah.
too, where that's the other thing is I've seen some books where the trigger warning list is like so long. It's like everything in the book,
Mhm.
and so it's like
Yeah.
it's such a hard line to know, you know, well, do you just do the major ones? Well, what are the major ones? Because what's going to be
Yeah.
major for one person might not be for another. And it's really hard to know what to include and what not and all of that. So it is
Yeah.
definitely I don't think there's an easy one size fits all answer to that question.
Yeah, I'd say the authors just use your discretion
Yeah.
Do the best you can. That's all we're all doing anyway. We're doing the best we
Right.
can. Every kind of rule or guideline is constantly changing. So even if you do it one way tomorrow, they might say, no, now you have to use this formatting, this
Right.
direction. So just do the best you can. And, same for readers. Do the best you can. And if you run into a trigger, lean on those supports, do what you have to do to take care of yourself. But for
Yeah.
all the love in the world, please put that book down.
Right. Well, and one of the things I wanted to say too, that's a somewhat of a unique opportunity we have in the indie community, and even
Mhm.
outside of it to some degree, is that I have had people message me and ask me specifically about certain trigger warnings in the Bloodstones or phase. And they
Right.
will ask me, hey, I was just wondering, I'm really excited to read your book. And I was, wondering if this particular content is in it. And then I can answer that and say, yep. And how much of a spoiler do you want? Because I'll tell you the whole scene if you want to know like exactly what you're getting into.
Mhm.
So especially in the indie community, I can't speak for all of the authors out there, but I don't have any issue with somebody, sending me a message on my website or on Twitter or whatever, and just asking me about a specific content warning.
J. Patricia Anderson says as well, it might be important for some smaller indie books because there aren't as many reviews and synopsis online that we can
Mhm.
find.
That's
Absolutely.
also true. Yep.
Yeah.
I want to make sure there's a lot of really great comments, and I'm behind as I usually am. Cal says, I struggle with nihilistic grimdark books because of how much it can affect me because of the everyday struggle. I need
Yeah.
something at the end of the tunnel or I can't read it. I'm the exact same, Cal.
Yeah.
I like grimdark, but like there has to be a purpose or somebody fighting something, like fighting back against something. Like, give
Right.
me
Yeah.
something. Yeah, I get that. Hey, Derry. I just answered your ADHD. I knew you were here. Don't worry about it. I just saw your first comment. Yeah, and I think again, this goes to show like it's so different for every
Yeah.
reader, and that's why it's just like with illnesses. There's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I agree with this to a certain extent too, Jerry, because I think the idea of trying to rate it kind of on a movie rating scale sometimes is almost easier. But again,
Mm.
it depends on the content and like what, it's yeah,
How much is being shown of the actual trigger as well?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um, okay, let's see. This is another thing, Zamar, that I've seen people do that I think has definite merits as an option where you could put,
Oh, yeah.
that there are content warnings specifically on the books page on your website or,
Mhm.
something like that. I recognize that there will be some readers that may not have access to that, but largely they would probably. Let's see. Yeah. And that's why I try to bring in all the people that aren't in a book reading community. I try to slowly reel them in because this is so helpful. I've had so many messages from Andrew Wizard and Kay and like other booktubers that I'm close friends with. They'll be like, oh, I saw you're reading this book, just so you know. And I appreciate that. I really do, because they know me well enough at this point,
Yeah.
that they can save me a lot of headache later. um,
Always happy to be the, bookish friend, ready to
right?
to
Ryan, I love this comment. I totally aim to pick up Prince of Thorns to read about this lawful good, nice guy surrounded by. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Even like I recently finished the Empires of Dust trilogy by Anna Smith Spark. I knew
Oh,
that was going
yeah.
to be really dark, and I
Mhm.
I 100% thought I was going to DNF that in the first book. I ended up loving it right to the end. I finished that trilogy. I read all the books back to back, which is if you know me, that's not normally the case. It takes me forever to finish a series, even a trilogy. And I absolutely love the way that the author dove into those dark scenes. A lot of them were I was okay with because they were alluded to, or they when they did go in deep, there was a lot of purpose behind the emotional
Mhm.
experience to the characters, and I adored that
Mhm.
because we saw just how much it impacted not that one person, but everyone around them. And all the explorations that this author did weren't just for the wow factor, they had a lot of
Right.
purpose behind them. So for me, I was okay with that. I was not anticipating that at all.
Yeah, I mean, Derry, that's a good point. Like the labels we have in the community versus the labels that you'll find at like a Barnes and Noble or a bookshop.
Very different.
Very different. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, please please ask the community. If you're in a community, please ask them.
Yeah.
Because that's a great resource too, if you have that option. A weird thing where I like to test my limits. Yeah, that's something where like everybody's going to have a different threshold. Yeah. I specifically don't go out of my way to seek that kind of stuff out because like I personally am not trying to find anything in it. But again, that's, you know, my personal threshold. So, yeah, exactly, Zamar. Like I sat down and thought about, okay, if I were to include like a content warning at the beginning of Bloodstones, like what do I include? You know, like there, there's so many things. But yeah, Erickson and Hobb, there you go, Derry. Absolutely. Which is funny because that was the weird thing about Ship of Magic for me was that a lot of similar content in Malazan did not have the same effect on me that Hobb did because of the way that it's written. Because I feel, and I could get into why, because I think that I know why they write or how they write slightly differently. But yeah, I mean, the same, like two different authors, same content, vastly different response. Yep, Cal too. Everybody check out Cal's books. Another indie author. Yeah. So especially in the indie community, I think reaching out to authors and asking if there's something very specific that you're very sensitive to. I mean, they shouldn't have an issue answering that question.
Well, and I think it's same like you were talking about community. If you're watching a booktuber's channel and you see that they read a book and you're curious, but you're concerned about that trigger, just try and reach out if you can. If they have a means of, you know, Twitter or something, and more often than not, you'll find they're happy to help too.
Bex, I'm just fine spoiling myself in order to avoid my triggers. Let's see. Yeah, for sure. If you're asking for reviewers or anything like that, that might be for sure something that would be important to include.
Yeah, I would say especially if your book isn't out yet and there's not a lot of information either, because sometimes I get those ARC requests where really the pitch is 2 sentences, which is fine, but more details, even in the blurb, can help with my discernment of whether or not it's a book for me.
Yeah, and that's another good point, Derry. If the author isn't available, they're, you know, in the Discords or on Twitter, you know, reaching out to one of the booktubers that you know has read the book. It depends on your perspectives in, because again, like I said, with Ship of Magic, I had a way harder time with that than I did with anything I've read in Malazan so far. I agree that like on an objective level, sure. But yeah, it really depends on the perspective, I think. So as we move into characters and kind of books specifically, one of the questions that I have seen pop up in the community now and again that I thought would be of interest to us in this conversation was, should authors be able to include characters that they don't directly relate to, which may kind of seem like a weird question to ask, but I think it's definite. I've seen it come up quite a few times, and that's one that always kind of made me pause, because I'm like, well, if I just populated my books with clones of myself, it'd be super boring. You know? And like I say that as somebody who has DID, who has like multiple options for characters. You know what I mean? Like, so
I love how you sold that.
Thank you. You know, if you can't joke about it a little bit,
humor is everything.
Humor is everything. But yeah, so Kay, if somebody, you know, like, well, for example, you and I are kind of sort of in this situation right now because I'm writing a character.
Sorry, I just saw Joe's comment.
Thanks, Joe. I'm writing a character right now who has, you know, chronic pain, physical pain. So, as a reader, how do you feel about that?
I don't see why not. I don't have any issue with it because I've had amazing reads for and finding characters that I relate to or have accurate representation that at least I can relate to because everyone's
Mhm.
experience is different, who the authors don't have personal
Yeah.
experience with that. But what I have found in talking to those authors is they often did their research, like we were talking about earlier, where you were consulting with
Yeah.
me on some things for this character in particular.
Mhm.
K.E. Andrews did a phenomenal job with Hills of Heather and Bone for the
Absolutely.
exact same reason. Her main character, has arthritis,
Mhm.
and phenomenal representation and how accurate its portrayal is. But she consulted with friends and people she knew to ensure it's an accurate representation, and she was getting it as closely as she could. To
Mhm.
me, as a reader, I thoroughly appreciate it. I will say
Mhm.
it's not a requirement for an
No, for
author to
sure
do
not.
that.
Yeah.
How far the author wants to go down the rabbit hole to ensure that accuracy and the authenticity to their story is up to the author. I
Mhm.
will also read just for the sake of escapism,
Mhm.
because maybe I do need to see that person who struggles with chronic pain have a win and defeat the bad lord and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Even if it's, these people are bouncing up thousands, 20 feet in the air. That's not going to be realistic to anything. But I do have an appreciation for that at times, right?
Yeah.
I read for that reason, but when I find those reads like Hills of Heather and Bone, um, those hit a lot harder. They stick with me a lot longer, and I certainly appreciate it. I don't think you need to experience something in order to convey it in a story, but I
Mhm.
think readers will certainly appreciate it if you do your due diligence in the background to try your best to represent it as accurately as you can.
Mhm.
So no, not a requirement at all. Write what you want to write, tell the story you want to tell, and you're going to find your readers. And maybe you won't, but maybe next book you will. You never
And
know.
maybe you make a mistake,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
and
okay. Like, learn from it, move on, like
yeah.
there's so many I mean, we were talking about earlier the ask yourself why, right?
Mhm.
If you're creating this character and you decide or discover that
Mhm.
this character has a particular struggle, you know, okay, how does that fit in, like we said, with
Mhm.
the puzzle pieces of this character as a whole, and how does that fit into the story? And when you're doing that kind of self reflection as the
Mhm.
author, I think it shows. I mean, it's very clear to me when I read books where I know the author has paid attention to this
Yeah.
particular thing or has experienced it themselves.
Yeah.
um so, and kind of like we talked about too, making sure that you're looking through how does this affect the character in the different facets of their life and in the story.
Yeah.
um, that's some easy like starting points for character design.
Yeah. I think, just another example of it, at least in terms that, many, parents might relate to, and this is always gonna be a pet peeve, and I'm sorry for bringing it up, but birthing scenes in stories, you can tell when the author's experienced it or they've been close to it, and you can tell when they haven't, and
Mhm.
when they're using it for a shock factor, and
Mhm.
all I can say is, as a parent, please leave those pregnant women alone in fantasy.
Yep.
Please leave them, be a little kinder, but I also understand that that's to drive a certain aspect forward, right? When in certain stories, it does have an impact, but it always cuts a little it always cuts a little nerve for me, and it's gonna be different for every reader. Some readers won't care. Some books, I don't care because 'cause I'm having a good time, but, I do think that if you are an author and you haven't experienced something and you're not allowed to explore it in a story, how do you build empathy for it as a person? How do you grow as a creative? How do you build empathy for it? Same for us as readers. How are we going to have the opportunity to build empathy and grow as people? I know we're talking about fantasy, but we experience all kinds of stuff through fantasy. It's not just action, there's a lot of
Right.
emotional journeys. How can we as the reader expect to do those things without allowing the author space to do those things as
Right.
well?
And that comes back to like with the responsibility as a reader, you know, if I read something where I see a character that has PTSD or DID
Mhm.
or anything like that, and I think maybe there's a few things about it that might be a little bit not accurate from what I've
Mhm.
experienced or what I know about the disorder at large, it is okay to write constructive reviews. That's what reviews are for, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to say again, because that, like, there's ways to write constructive reviews for other readers that's very honest and open about your experience with a book without trashing the author,
Okay.
which is, I think, sometimes I see that sometimes and it makes me really sad because I'm like, okay, yes, I know that we had a strong reaction to this, but let's like, there's a constructive way to say, so I didn't like some of the language that was used around the
Mm.
character that has DID, specifically a couple of things that I noticed and that,
Yeah.
you know, isn't my favorite because X. You know, there's ways to do that that
Yeah.
isn't, you know, aggressive or
I think
like super negative.
Oh, exactly, and I think it applies to even, like, things like tropes. I've done this in reviews too, where a certain trope didn't work for me, but I know it'll work for someone else. Right, so that I always kind of, in those kind of reviews, I'll just touch on it quick and say, "This didn't work for me, however, I appreciated this other aspect, and I do think this trope might be more
Yeah,
enjoyable to this kind of reader."
right.
Right, like romantasy is a big one. Those love tropes
Yep.
when they get very trope heavy, they generally don't work for me. However, I know lots of people who will adore those scenes,
Right.
and it's just, you know, you gotta remember, take everything with a grain of salt, um, be a decent person. Try, you know, don't trash over people, don't trash over creative work, but you can share your experience in a way that is still helpful and positive to others without being a negative Nelly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So going into our particular experiences with fantasy books,
Mhm.
we have two questions that we're going to go over. One is, what would we like to see less of, and
Mm.
what would we like to see more of that we have really enjoyed in the books that we've read? Because I pulled a few books, and
Mhm.
I don't know if you have a few to recommend too. You had some really good recommendations on your video, also, which again, everybody is down in the description box. You can go watch Kay's video. Um, So let's start with the less of so we can end on the positive note.
Let's do it.
um, what have we noticed in fantasy books that when it comes to physical illness or mental illness that we'd like to see less of?
For me, when it becomes the entire identity and the woe is me.
Mm-hmm.
I know that is an experience, absolutely an experience, but I
Yep.
think at a certain point, especially as you're getting into, like, let's say this is a 3 or 4 book series,
Mm-hmm.
that can't be the experience the entire
The
time.
entire time. Yeah.
I think there is a point where that character does not need to start experiencing growth. I am a character-driven reader, mind you, so I am always looking for the characters to grow and develop. I love seeing those journeys,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that, the woe is me lasting years of a character's life and the consuming identity of it, where there is no other factor to their personality. They are just this thing they have.
Right.
They don't have other interests. Like they can't possibly be interested in sports or, you know, other activities because this is their identity.
Right.
This thing that they're diagnosed with is their identity. They can't possibly be intellectual because their physical pain holds them back too much.
Yeah.
I'd say those kind of things I would like to see less of because they don't feel authentic to me
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I think kind of going along with that, that these characters oftentimes feel a bit like cardboard cutouts because they're kind of an afterthought, right? They're just
Yeah,
kind of thrown in the story to check some boxes or
that
just to
token
make something
representation over here.
interesting. Yeah, or it would be interesting if I gave this character PTSD randomly, you know, like just kind of a throw it in there sort of thing. um and also, these characters are not cannon fodder, like we mentioned with the pregnant ladies. Like, please,
Yeah.
like, it's fine. It's not like
Yeah.
you're never allowed to kill, you know, any
No.
characters that have these things, but like the idea that you just know as soon
Mhm.
as, because it's and that kind of ties in with another thing that I really would like to see less of, is that these characters kind of become emotional cash cows.
Yeah.
Right, where like we're gonna get the reader because they're sad and pathetic in some way, and then we're gonna like, you know, get that shock value in there, and it's so frustrating to read that, because you know the minute they show up on screen you're like, well,
Checklist of people who might go first.
on the
You
top.
know?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. The other one too is forgetting the illness when it's convenient. Like,
Oh,
yes, this
yes.
person has like this really debilitating thing that they deal with, and then there's a battle, or they need to ride, you
Yeah.
know, ride a horse, or they need whatever thing it is, and suddenly we kind of like forget they have it for a while.
Same thing for injuries. I've read that with injuries too. The
Mm-hmm.
character gets mortally wounded, and then all of a sudden they're like perfectly fine, and then oh no, they forgot they were they
Yeah,
were
exactly.
they were on their deathbed. Yeah, I think in terms of those aspects too, it's important to remember that sometimes, you know, that escapism is what we want, you know, what readers are looking for, and some readers won't care.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you know, for myself, I always appreciate it more
Mm-hmm.
when there's some thought and forethought put into
Mm-hmm.
it, planning and terms of its execution as well. You know, you can tell the difference basically. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, please leave the pregnant ladies alone. Thank you, Derry.
I mean,
I
I
know.
do agree, Derry, that
Yeah.
like, you know, childbirth is a thing that can be very
Yeah.
inherently dangerous.
I'm more
Totally
talking
agree.
about raids on villages where you get that one token pregnant lady who, didn't survive and the main character goes into crisis over it. Absolutely, I understand it's part of the journey, it is part of life, and that is an experience to, you know, to explore, but more often than not, I've seen the, and it's not even just them, you know, meeting their end, there's other scenes I've seen where,
Mhm.
like, I they would not be up and ready to fight that quick, and some people might, but anyway, point being, my heart aches for those
Right.
those ladies.
And like, you know, as a doula too, modern medicine is its own culprit when it comes to pregnant ladies, but that's a whole different topic.
Oh,
um,
I did have I it'll come back to me, I had one and I wanted to okay, no, it came back to me. I think a good comparison in terms of, you know, relating, what we wanna see less of, there's an entire debate between classic fantasy and the busty lasses and how women are described in that way, where they're you remember in classic fantasy, I'm sure we've had this discussion too, where
mhm,
the females of those stories are often described in a very particular way, and it's usually with
mhm,
regards to their physicality,
mhm.
and I think it's very easy to for me to relate those kind of things. Things I'd like to see less of in terms of those
Right,
representations. I'd like to see more depth than just token, this is what the character has, token female
right,
character has bust.
right. Derry says, "Woe is me. Fitz totally suffers with depression. Has had it all his life. He still gets
Mm.
up every day. As someone with depression, it's oddly accurate." Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think there, Fitz's "woe is me" is. I feel like you said, he's still getting up every day. He's doing
yes.
things. He's like, you know what I mean? Like there's so many different facets to his character,
Yeah.
that aren't just depressed Fitz.
And to me, that would be growth. That would be
Yeah,
development to the character. Fighting every day. You survived a day and you're still going. You survived
yeah,
another day and you're still going. That's development. The woe is me, I was more talking about where the character never grows. They never move
right.
past it and they
Where there's
never
nothing else about them shown.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's their identity at that point.
yeah. Thanks for joining us, Samar.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, like spend some time with your kid.
Yeah.
This is like, regardless of whether they struggle with a physical or mental illness, like know your characters. You know that cardboard cutout isn't fun no matter who the character is.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. There was a couple of things that I wanted to go back to. Um, I'm not an author and have no aspirations to become one. I imagine that writing any character is about knowing that every single person is the hero of their own story from their learned specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, What's interesting is I found that a lot of times villain characters believe they're the hero of the story,
Yep.
and the heroes are the ones that have imposter syndrome and think that they're somehow not good enough to be the hero of the story. Let's see. It's probably worth discussing how fantasy and magic interacts with these questions. Do you hate, love magical healing, solving insolvable problems, magic stuff that remembers them? That's a really good point, Joe. Because we had mentioned that, Kay, when we were talking about the other thing where like magic just suddenly makes it all better kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think I could definitely see a lot of different ways that magic could be utilized in conjunction with an illness that could be really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, and my rule of thumb when it comes to magic stuff in general is, what is the cost? That's always my first question, because I enjoy reading stories where it isn't just a, you know, endless well. There's what are we losing? What's the cost? How does it like change the character to use it? Questions like that. So as long as it's not just like, and then poof, she was all better and now she's an interesting character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, which I don't think is what Joe was asking about, but
No, but
to the
I
point.
mean, I like it. Like you said, I think usually there is a cost that has to go with it because there is give and take. In the event that there wouldn't be a cost and magically they're poof, that probably wouldn't be the book for me.
Mhm.
But someone else might enjoy it. Someone else might want that, magical relief. They might want that hope that someday that might
Mhm.
happen for them.
Mhm.
There's a
Mhm.
book for all kinds of readers. For me, I like seeing the consequences, the give and take, or maybe necessarily like Hills of Heather and Bone. I'm going back to that one again because there is that magic system and healing for this character, but it's a constant battle back and forth because it might assist with the pain, but it's not a permanent solution.
I'm still muted. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was just agreeing with you. I'm actually hoping to read that book
Oh,
potentially
interesting.
in the next year here. So I'm curious to see how that goes. J. Patricia Anderson says, I've had a delivery scene planned for like 20 years, and I used to think it would be from someone else's perspective because how would I ever know? But now I know. Yeah, going through things definitely changes the way that you would write it, for sure. You've read First Law.
Yes, I
Yeah.
have.
That's a really interesting character to bring up. I think Glocta's a kind of in the like weirdly in the same vein as Fitz, where like, yeah, Glocta's pretty like, you know,
He's pretty miserable.
he's pretty miserable all the time, but he still has that little like, there's a spark of like that anger that drives him.
Yeah.
There's yes, he's dealing with this huge list of things that he deals with,
Yes.
but also there's that, you see like that spark almost overshadows that for me. You
Yeah,
know,
like,
like
I
there's,
will do better. People will not suspect me, but it'll be
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's, I do feel like his character is pretty nuanced in that way. And that Abercrombie doesn't utilize him in a way that makes me feel like, oh, and then suddenly he didn't have these issues, you
No,
know?
h his character work was thoughtfully done in the sense of consistency, especially in the type of world that they're in.
Mhm.
But he does have that fire underneath the misery
Yeah.
of it all. He has a miserable life and he has all these issues. They don't magically go away. He deals with them, but there was also that, perspective of other characters around him that you can see where there's the pity, there's the disgust, there's the shame, and he deals with all of these things. And he also struggles with being in a position of power, and this is going to be spoiler
Mhm.
free. Don't worry. He deals with being in a position of power, but also the physical incapabilities that
Yeah.
he tries to hide, and he curses every day. And so that dynamic, I think, was really well portrayed as well.
Hmm. Let's see. Nalini Singh has a character who suffered spinal injury as a child. A ways into the series is offered vampirism that will eventually heal them. 2 books of pain and still suffering and in share. I think what's interesting about that, and I think Kay obviously will have probably a more probably a better response to this than I will, but I like that you're showing a lot of both sides of whatever's going to happen to this character, maybe.
I'm not familiar with this one. But to me, there could be multiple factors going into this depending on the kind of story it is. The concept of eventually healing them, 2 books of pain and still suffering, I think it depends on how the author's handling it in terms of my own personal reading enjoyment. To me, there's potential for a great character arc there, in terms of not just dealing with the chronic pain, but the mental health aspect that goes with it. But in terms of the other relationships that they have, as this seems to be a bit of a symbiotic relationship between the vampire too. Who knows? It seems like it has a lot of interesting facets, but again, it depends. It all comes down to how the author is going to explore it.
Yeah. Cal says anger and spite is a powerful motivator in chronic illness. Defiance in the face of misery. Yeah, I love stories like that. I always have. I've always loved the characters that like have nothing left and they still like claw their way up and they want to like fight anyways. I love characters like that so much.
How dare you try and knock me down? How dare you? Like, watch me. Just
watch me get up again. Yeah. I don't have chronic pain, but I admire that Abercrombie didn't make him a stereotype. I think it's always hard to get concrete definitions on these things. You can think you're describing exactly the kind of character that annoys you, only to realize that it also describes a favorite character.
It all comes down to personal experience, which is why it's hard to put these into categories, to answer these in a definitive way, because we're all growing, we're all learning and changing as people. My opinions today might be different tomorrow, right? Depending on the experiences I go through. So I think it's important to remember that, these are all opinions based on the present experiences of our lives. And that defines our reading experience too. What I enjoy today, I might not enjoy tomorrow. And it just comes down to what life throws our way. And I think it's okay to remember and remind ourselves that journey is going to change, to be kind to ourselves, to be kind to others, because our opinions are always going to differ in a lot of things. Even if we agree on things, great. That's, you find comrades, you find support. That's fantastic. But I think the best relationships also come from being okay to disagree and still finding a common ground and growing together in relationships. That's important too.
And having open conversations about the things that you disagree on without, canceling each other.
Exactly.
Over.
Yeah. But yeah, life is a journey. There's all kinds of stuff. And I think putting down a wall and not letting yourself experience things is only, it's a disservice more to yourself.
Yeah.
Anything.
I enjoy reading a variety of characters with disorders or struggles similar to what I have, because it shows me the different ways that people can respond to the same thing, right? And I think that that's really important. That was something I utilized in Phased, was 2 sisters who go through very similar trauma, almost exactly the same trauma, and the way that they respond to it is almost completely opposite because of who they are as people. So I think keeping yourself, even as you're reading things that might showcase something you struggle with, being open to saying, is this just the way that somebody else would respond? I don't know if you guys can hear that. We are having a torrential downpour outside my house. Derry is telling, Nalini Singh's Guild Hunter series, Urban Paranormal Romance. I liked that the healing wasn't a magical overnight cure, that they would need to work in physio. They are working with changes to their relationships with others. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a facet that I would love, because for me, I go to physio. I go to physio often. Right. And for me, that would be relatable. It'd be nice to see the work being put in, because there's even perceptions on physio where I've said, I've got physio going on. I can't make it to this X, Y, or Z event. And I've had people say, oh, that sounds relaxing. You've never been to physio. Never. If you tell me that, no.
No, usually physical therapists are they will work you hard.
They're merciless. My physiotherapist has a chalkboard of nicknames, and some of them are like torturer and tormentor, like queen of pain.
We love that. You'll have to write her into a book someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, my 82-year-old grandfather is going through some physical therapy right now and having very strong things to say about it. So I totally get that.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fair, Derry. And I typically, when I'm talking to friends too, I will give caveats, like even if,
Mm,
especially if we're going out in public or something like that, I'll just say, hey, having a little bit of a, like,
yeah.
rougher day today. And part of that is building those relationships, like, that, people are like, okay, cool.
Yeah. Great.
Great.
Need something? No? Yes? What we'll work on it, whatever you need. Because I've done that too. I've done check-ins, with you too, like, "Hey, how's it going today? What's"
Yeah.
and you tell me, "Do you wanna talk? Do you not wanna talk?" Either way, I'm there.
Yep.
What do you need?
Yeah. Yeah. Knowing that ear is there, and that
Yeah,
person who just, yep, is willing to hear about your day, whatever it looks
exactly.
like.
Yeah, and being
um
willing to be okay with that as a person too, because sometimes there's that
mhm,
hovering, that pressure to feel like you need to do something to help someone. Sometimes doing
right.
nothing is helpful,
Yeah.
and, being okay with that is important too.
Absolutely. There was a story you told me when we were talking about the things we wanted to see more of in fantasy, and we talked a lot about nuance, and we kind of
Mhm.
touched on that a little bit already in the conversation. But you told me a story about a veteran with
Yes.
the bees and the veteran story that I thought was just fascinating and really goes to show how nuanced some of these things can be.
Yeah, so this story is not my own. I will put that out there. I'll try and send you the name of the channel. I believe it's Nurse Hadley. So this is a nurse who deals with hospice. And for those who don't know, that's end of life care. Typically for those who are suffering from severe disease or just old age. In this case, she was talking or sharing this story of a conversation she had with a war veteran, and he was talking about PTSD and how him and his friends have had different experiences with it. But for him in particular, it was bees.
Mm-hmm.
What was triggering for him was bees because the sound of a bee buzzing by his ear was the same sound as the bullet near missing him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was triggering for him. And what he did over the years was he built a garden to make peace with the bees. And it's such a simple story, but it warmed my heart so much because it's such to us, it would seem like nothing. Build a garden and the bees come, not an issue. For this gentleman, it was such a journey for him. It was hard. Putting
Yeah.
in flowers in the ground, that must have been so difficult at first, and to make that choice to make peace with the
Mm-hmm.
bees. Ah, yeah,
That's
warms
really,
my
I
heart.
love that story. That was such a beautiful way to, like, take your healing into your own hands in a way
Yeah.
that, is really beautiful.
And to have that visual representation of it too, right? The more you think about this,
Mhm.
it's a beautiful garden
Yeah.
in their yard, and every time for us, for many people, it'd be like, "Oh, that's a pretty flower. That's a beautiful garden." For this gentleman, it had so much more meaning.
Yeah. I would agree with that, Cal. I do think that there's a lot
Yeah.
of, especially I would say from my reading experience with PTSD and things like that, where um, you get to see them in the traumatic event or in the early stages of
Mhm.
trauma. But yeah, I would love to see, like, more of the stages of healing, and
Yeah.
how, what that looks like. Not that it disappears per se, but what does that look like as you move forward in your healing journey?
Yeah.
Because yeah, there's lots of phases. There's the thinking about planting the garden for 5 years before you actually
Yes.
do it, you know, and then
Yeah.
planting one flower, and then
Yeah. Just to see how it goes.
then changing your mind, and then yeah,
Yeah.
thinking about it some more. So,
Yeah.
um, was there anything else in the what we want to see more of that you wanted to bring? I feel like we've kind of sprinkled it throughout the
Yeah.
conversation, but I wanted to share a few book recommendations at the end of the stream with them. But was there anything else about that specifically you wanted to bring up before we went into that?
I mean, I think, like you said, we kind of sprinkled it all throughout our conversation. In general, authors, I'd love to see more rep. Indie authors are killing it with how they're handling tropes and storylines and characters in such unique ways. Keep doing that, please, because you guys are doing an amazing job of representing all kinds of stories and all kinds of experiences. Push the boundaries of your creativity and uh, keep telling stories, honestly. For myself, I'm just happy to keep reading, and I'm happy to continue to see how those themes are explored, no matter which direction they take, whether it's for me or if it's not. I'm just happy to see more people taking an interest in trying to convey those stories. So keep doing it, keep going, and keep telling your stories, because that's what's important to me anyway.
Yeah. I agree, Cal.
Yeah. A terrifying roller coaster is the best way to say it.
Healing is not linear. That's another thing that I think a lot of, in stories, we like to lay things out, and, there's the very specific sequence of events.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes I think we feel like whatever our character is dealing with also has to follow that same kind of like step-by-step process. It usually isn't that pretty. Just mess it up a little bit.
Just throw, a little cog in the wheel there. I think a good example, like in terms of sharing stories, a good example of that was, I thought I had my pain management routine set. I was like, yes, I've got this sorted out. And then I became a parent. And then all of that went out the window. And I had to relearn everything, try my best. And there was no control over things, because if you've had a child, you know that you don't get to sit down and have a piece of toast when you want the piece of toast.
No.
The toast is no longer yours. It is the child's. So it was a completely different learning curve. And I'm still kind of coming out of that like loopy part that was really scary, and having to relearn everything. So yeah, you can think you have it under wraps, and yeah, the rug's going to get pulled out from under you at some point, unless you have zero changes in your lifestyle and in your life completely, which, I mean, sounds great, but when you think of it, that means, you're not having any adventures. You're not experiencing life to the fullest. You're twisting life to suit you. And that might work for some people, but for me, I want to enjoy life and the adventures it has. And yeah, it's gonna hurt.
Yep.
It's gonna get hard, but I'll make it through.
Yeah. I think that's the difference between a victim mentality and a survivor mentality, which we've also talked about at length, where, it's okay to acknowledge that the things are hard, and that, hard things happen to you. And also, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
The question that I ask myself every day.
Yeah.
What are you going to do with it now?
Exactly. A lot of it comes down to perspective, and that goes to the healing journeys as well.
Yep.
Perspective is going to change a lot of things for you. So yeah, let's talk about books.
Derek says the toast is no longer yours. The coffee is no longer hot. The bathroom is no longer private. Amen.
It's 100% my life right now, Derek. I love it, but also I want my toast.
Right. More bread.
Yeah, more bread.
Brittany says, sometimes I wake up and wonder why bother, but I've realized that sometimes the bravest thing to do is get up every day and keep going. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we get to meet cool people and have cool conversations like the one we're having this evening.
Exactly. With all these fantastic individuals. Yes.
So, Kay, what books would you recommend for the audience that you have particularly liked when it comes to physical or mental illness?
So I will say, if you want a prepared version of this, the video that is on my channel, I'm talking about chronic pain and fantasy, is probably a much more organized. That is absolutely one of them. I did not prepare. I didn't grab my books off the shelves than I should have. But
I'm so disappointed in you, Kayla.
You think after 2 years I would have more preparation skills? Absolutely not. My life is chaos, people.
I'll hold up the books for you.
Thank you. Yes, Hills of Heather and Bone for accurate representation of chronic pain. Absolutely. phenomenal. K.E. Andrews did such an incredible job. And yes, I spam messaged her with praise throughout the entire experience because it was, for me, highly relatable. I love how it was handled in a fantastical adventure as well, because you get that crazy chase that they're going on. They're trying to escape this high stakes. Their life, their lives are on the line, and yet they have to deal with this too. And it's done in a believable way.
Mhm.
Mixing that in with fantasy is not easy. So absolutely great one.
She also does a really good job, I will say, with miscarriage and birth, for those who are talking
Yes.
about that in the comments, which was very cool.
Phenomenal representation of that as well. I usually don't say that because some people consider it spoilers, but I'm glad you did, because now I can. No, absolutely. I'm
Whoops.
paranoid about spoilers, so
I try to be good about it, but since it was something that came up in the chat, I was like, I'll
yes,
throw it out there. And I
absolutely.
also was, talking about that book specifically. Katie and I had a really long conversation about both of those topics, and she was, I think she handled them very well.
Absolutely, yeah. And this one was within reach, but authors in the chat: J. Patricia Anderson, Your Blood and Bones. This is a
Can't wait to read that one.
what's the word? Novella. I was going to say novelette. It's not. It's a novella, but it handles a lot of facets of illness really well. But the big one that stood out to me was the grief perspective and
Mm.
how life is impacted. But it's done from two different experiences, because there's two main characters that are dealing with it, and how vastly similar and different they are. I really appreciated. So yeah, the that's really well done. Well done. Absolutely love that one. You do one, and I'm gonna put myself on mute and try and find another one. And yes,
Searching
Carrie,
fails.
fake booktuber alert.
um, Okay, well, I'm gonna say, if you're looking for a giant series, Malazan is one that I always recommend to people that are used to, or like have been reading fantasy for a while, because I think that Erickson's the way that he expresses human experience in many different forms is incredibly nuanced and careful. Like, he does such a good job, not careful in the sense that he holds back, but it's just really very intentional. That's the word that I was looking for. But I pulled a little stack of books to show you guys. Yep, Anitha, bingo for Tori. Mark your bingo cards. I said Malazan. This is a non-fantasy book, but if you're interested in reading what I thought was an incredibly nuanced exploration of combat PTSD specifically, I read The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien last year. And this is a heavy read, so just be aware of that. But what I loved about this one is he wrote how with PTSD you can get trapped in this cycle, and it can be really hard to break out of that. This had, I think, one of the best visual representations of that I've ever read. Phenomenal book, especially if you're interested in reading or writing combat PTSD. I would highly recommend reading this book. Your turn, Kay.
I managed to grab one. I feel like I could grab a couple others, but I risk dismantling my setup here. So I will name them, but in this case, Different Not Damaged. This is actually a short story anthology. It has 6 short stories with all phenomenal representation, from PTSD to chronic pain and you name it. So this is a great one as well. Obviously, the one that stood out more for me was the one with chronic pain, where a priestess takes on the pain of others physically. So she physically removes the pain from others and takes it onto herself. You can imagine the load that would be for someone to do, for an entire city of people flocking to you. So that's just one of them. There is one with autism as well. So definitely this is one I would say go check this out. However, I will put a caveat to this, because this is grimdark. So there is that facet as well to keep in mind. So while I think I'd say 1 or 2 of these stories does have some form of positivity you can take out of it, some silver lining. For the majority of them, they're pretty dark.
Dark.
So keep that in mind. I personally do enjoy that, because at times, I find it a bit more realistic,
Mm.
and I do appreciate that. As much as I do love rainbows and silver linings, and I do need those books,
Mhm.
sometimes it's nice to have that reality still there and
Mhm.
not sugarcoat it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and have it in an interesting storyline. So I would say that one too.
Another one I read this year is Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. This is a really beautiful kind of folklore fantasy about a young woman whose family is cursed and she is the only one who can reverse it. It is so character driven, and she by herself pretty much drives the entire story with the side cast around her, and the themes of grieving a life lost. We were talking about that earlier, and also living with trauma and different facets of that. I think is handled very, very well. There is a content warning in this one for a scene that I will, if you're interested in reading it, message me somewhere and I'll let you know. But excellent handling of trauma and of grief, and dealing with a life completely heading in a direction that you did not want or did not see coming.
Yeah.
Your turn, Kay.
Yeah, I managed to grab another one. Sorry. I know I'm making weird faces as I'm trying to grab them. This is another short story anthology, but this is Alchemy of Sorrow. This is by 13 different authors, I believe. The story in particular, there's a lot of powerful stories in here, including grief, loss of loved ones, but talking about that experience from getting that diagnosis. There is that storyline covered in this. I believe it is Sonia M. Black. I'll see if I can find the actual title, but it's in the video that I did as well. Basically, it follows a warrior who has served her empire, and in this, they bond with phoenixes, not dragons. But during a battle, she was injured in a way that she can no longer be of service. And her entire life was defined by being of service to her empire and being the best that she could be. And having all of that ripped away was very powerful in its telling. It was really well done, and the dedication starts off with being dedicated to all chronic pain warriors, which up until that point I had never considered myself a warrior. So kudos to the author for putting that there, because I never I never would have thought of myself as that. But yes, Sonia M. Black did a fantastic job at exploring the diagnosis, the new life, the grief of it, but also accepting help, accepting the new life, and trying to go through the new normal, and whether or not it takes over you or you take control yourself. So all of those themes are really well explored, and that's a short story. That's just
Yeah.
in a short story. So
Yeah.
yeah, really well done. But yeah, I'd recommend the whole anthology.
This one might. It was funny because when I saw it on the shelf, I was like, actually, The Martian by Andy Weir. This book obviously deals with some pretty heavy isolation themes. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this was all of the different ways that the main character copes with a impossible situation mentally. There's so many moments of roller coaster in this book where, he's facing death essentially every day. And he's, like we talked about, he's getting up and he's going to do something about it. But he has his days where he's just like, it'd be easier if I just gave up. It would be easier if I just didn't do this. And the roller coaster, I think, was really well done in that, of the reality of how we don't linearly follow how we respond to experiences like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good one. The other two, I won't attempt to reach because I will break something if I try. But they're both by Patricia Meredith.
Mm.
And this is more in the fun category, but also having some accurate representation in it, where Patricia Meredith writes, thank you, Tori. I know you're going to grab that.
Uh-huh.
So Butcher Baker, Candlestick Taker, and A Deed of Dreadful Note. These are historical fiction mystery thrillers, so they're murder mysteries. But there are characters in both that deal with a debilitating physical disease. And I love that. And they share similarities, but the similarity is that it doesn't stop their intellectual curiosity and their drive for improvement as people and their contribution to their society.
Mm.
I loved those representations, and they're not necessarily main characters either. These are side characters, but I think she did them really well and still made the story fun, thrilling, exciting while capturing, they deal with their physical limitations. They do have hard days. They push through, and you see them through the view of someone outside themselves. So you're not always getting their POV. You're seeing them through another's eyes, and seeing that, I think they were done really, really well. And again, just that reminder that you're not defined by your physical limitations. You're defined by how far you want to take yourself. Do you
Mhm.
want to allow yourself to have that curiosity and that intellectual exploration in the world? Or will you let your physical body decide how far your journey will go in life?
Mhm.
So, yeah, both of those really well done as well.
Yes, agreed. Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong.
Mhm.
Um, Grief of a Life Lost is
Yeah.
definitely in here. And also, I found a really interesting take on what I would consider a dissociative disorder, not necessarily
Oh.
DID, but who would know there are actually many different dissociative disorders, not
Mm.
just DID. And there's a character in here that I got to the end of the book and I was like, you know, this actually really makes a lot of sense if you put it in the light of a dissociative disorder. And I thought it was really interesting and shows the negative sides of what can happen when you
Mm.
detach from, and instead of being open and vulnerable and reaching out, what can happen when you go inward and you close off. But I highly recommend this book for a lot of reasons, but I really liked the mental health representation in it also.
Yeah, that one's really well done, I will say.
Yes, 100% Patricia. There are definitely some content
Yes.
warnings in there as well. Do you have any other ones? I have one more.
You go ahead. I don't think I have one off the top of my head. Like I said, you think I'd be better prepared. I do have some nonfiction ones, but this conversation's fantasy. So,
Okay. So this is my favorite YA series, and that is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is one that I haven't talked about on my channel for a while, but there is a character in here, Kaz Brecker, if you've read it, who has a mental illness that I'll be very careful on spoilers for, but it is what I appreciated about it was through the entire duology, it has an effect. Like it's a very visual effect that I think was handled really, really well. And there's a scene, particularly in the second book, where this character has to do something that directly confronts this PTSD that he has. And that is one of the best, like, mental health scenes or mental illness scenes I think I have ever read. Like, it was so poignant, and the show of, like, how hard it was to trust somebody else in this scene, it was just so well done. So this is actually one that, even for my adult fantasy fans, this is a YA series I highly recommend. I really, really love it.
Good to know. I've heard a lot about it, but it's just one of those books that I've never
I'll
I've never
reread it
gotten to.
when you get that far.
Deal.
So, yeah, guys, drop some in the chat.
Absolutely.
If you have some books that you've read that you think are good fits. And also feel free to drop those down in the comments under the video so that they're permanent for people that are coming back to watch the replay.
Yeah.
And again, if you haven't already, if somehow weirdly you're subscribed to my channel and not to Kay's channel, it's down below in the description box below, along with a link to her video so that you can go and watch that. We also have links to crisis hotlines down in the description box below if that's helpful for anyone. And yeah, like we said at the beginning, like there's no way that we can possibly do a topic this big justice in one sitting. But
Not at all.
I hope it was helpful for you guys, and I really appreciate all of the vulnerability and sharing in the chat, and you guys are always the best part of why we do what we do.
Yes.
So, and Kay, thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your story and your time.
Likewise, thank you for hosting, and thank you to everyone for joining us too, because we know that this is often sensitive topics for people, and that vulnerability, like Tori said, we really appreciate it. And the support that you show, not only to us, but everyone else in the community, is so important. So, yeah, thank you for having this conversation with us, and thank you for hosting, Tori.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, in the chat, thank you guys so much. I hope you are all having a wonderful week. And yeah, again, if you have any questions on content warnings of books that either Kay or I have read, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah.
And dairy, continue being defiant in the face of the daily struggle. Absolutely. Yeah. Cal, you are absolutely welcome to self-promo in the chat. No Land for Heroes deals with post-trauma growth. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's another rec you guys should put on your TBRs. And thank you to everybody who joined us. If you're watching the replay, we appreciate you as well. And I hope you all have a lovely evening.
And remember, take care of yourselves.
Bye, everybody.